We've got Dr Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission, joining us now. Sir, first, your first impressions of the government saying that this is an Amrit Kal budget, and in the short term, while it may seem that we haven't made any big announcements, in the long term, this is going to create infrastructure and jobs. Would you agree?
Well, look, whenever a budget is announced, finance ministers invariably present it as responding to a very large number of constituencies. I mean, you know, the children, the farmers, the women, the middle class, you name it. And I think the finance minister referred to all these constituencies. You know, as I see it, any budget is an open issue for debate, and you'll get the opposition will criticize it and the government side will praise it. But if you look at it objectively, how do you assess a budget? And I think let's lay that down. In my view, you would assess a budget by maybe the following kinds of criteria. One, what is the macro stance that the budget takes? Two, what does it do in terms of expenditures, both levels and composition? Is it saying the right thing? Three, has it made any big changes in taxation, and are they the right ones? And four, what's it talking about in terms of longer term reforms? Now, you know, if you subject this budget to that test, then I would say that, first of all, as far as the macro stance is concerned, I think there was nothing wrong with the budget. In fact, I'm glad that instead of the 6.8% of GDP fiscal deficit, which many people thought, because expenditure was a bit weak, that they would actually improve on it, I think she's actually set the budget deficit 6.9%. I mean, I think that the economy is still recovering. While it did well in the first 2 quarters, it has slowed down. And I think it was the right thing to do to spend more in the last couple of months. And the budget estimates that the revised estimates suggest that that's going to happen. So I think that part is definitely good. And for the next year, she's gone down by 0.5% of GDP. I think that's also the right thing to do. The fiscal deficit's still going to be quite high, because the fiscal deficit for the center is going to end up being about 6.4% of GDP, and they've allowed a larger deficit for the states of up to 4 percentage points, so that the total deficit is going to be something of the order of 10.4% of GDP, which is high by any sort of standard. But I think that for one more year, because I don't think that we are in a good position as far as demand is concerned, if you want to achieve the sorts of growth rate targets that have been laid out, you probably do need to have a softer return to fiscal consolidation. So I'm quite happy with the macro stance that she's taken. Next question is expenditure. I mean, has she talked about all the right kinds of expenditures? You know, with expenditures, a lot depends on what actually happens. I mean, finance ministers very often announce large expenditures, which are a combination of PPP and this and that. You have to judge in the end whether it'll happen. But judging by the budget, the one message that comes across is big expenditures on infrastructure. I think that's the right thing to do. Some expenditure, she's done less actually than I would have thought in terms of schemes that might help the poor. But, you know, they can always be added to. I mean, McNarega is there, it's demand driven. And frankly, if they give the signal that, look, we will top up, if the demand for McNarega is high, please go ahead and spend, that will be good enough. But certainly not responding to these arguments that we need a stimulus for consumption, I think that's the right thing to do. Because, you know, the problem with consumption is that income is down. So if you could stimulate the economy and get income up, consumption will go up anyway. And I think the focus, whatever bullets she had, should have been spent on the investment-related stimulus. That's what she said she's going to do. And if they actually implement it, that's not a bad idea at all. So I think on the expenditure side, I think the only problem I have with the expenditure, I've not had enough time to study it, but I would have thought that she would make more of an allocation towards the vaccinations. Because, you know, last year, that is for the current year, it's a generous allocation of 39,000 crores for vaccination. But for the next year, it's down to, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000, something like that. Now, I don't know, maybe it's being assumed that we will achieve the 100% that we were supposed to get done by the end of December. Obviously, that didn't happen, but we are now 62. So maybe the feeling is that by the end of this year, this fiscal year, the vaccination, double vaccination will have been completed. But, you know, frankly, I think given the uncertainties about the pandemic and the notion that those who have been vaccinated may need a booster, I would have thought that I would have liked to see a bolder allocation for vaccinations. I mentioned this for another reason also, that is, unless you put in that bold allocation, they won't place orders. And you do not want to be stuck with not having placed orders. In my view would be that they should now clearly place orders on the Indian manufacturers really to cover the next 6 to 8 months, so that these manufacturers have no doubt that there's a demand for their product. And I found that missing. But other than that, I think the expenditure priorities she's laid out are quite right. You know, on the taxation front, the good news is she hasn't done very much, and you know that I think it's always a good idea. One of the things that businessmen are really scared about is if finance ministers before every budget are thinking of clever ideas of taxation, so they'll all sleep. They may not get they may not have got some of the benefits they wanted, but quite frankly, I think we had lowered our tax rates. So if somebody had said to me, no more benefits, I wouldn't care. There are a few benefits for, you know, on the provisions for the insurance or annuity for a child suffering from a disability, and that's quite a good thing. But other than that, there's not much, and I think there's nothing wrong with that.
You know, actually, so if I may just interrupt you for a second, because the finance minister was asked this in her post-budget press conference, and she said this twice. She said, I did not raise your taxes. And that in itself, I did not raise your taxes. So if your expectation was that I wouldn't, well, yes, then I've come good.
She's got a point there. She's got a point there. Yeah. No, I think that, look, whenever people are asked to make comments, going into a situation where everybody wants some kind of a tax benefit. So I'm quite sure that her civil servants must have received hundreds of recommendations, benefit here, benefit there, and so on. On the other hand, you're going into a situation where everybody is saying India has one of the largest fiscal deficits in the world. So there's also a danger that some bright fellow will say, let's increase the tax rates. And I think most businessmen would be quite pleased that there's been, you know, this is really an application of the Hippocratic oath. First of all, do no harm. So I don't blame her for that. You know, there is a role for taxation reform, but I personally believe that should be done after a lot of consideration through expert committees whose views are made public rather than, you know, rolled out in the middle of a budget in the midst of secrecy. So I'm quite glad that we haven't seen any of that, and I think businessmen would be quite happy with that too. The real issue then is, what about reforms? Because, you know, the challenge she faces, or we all face really, is this year the NSSO says that the GDP is going to grow by 9.2%. This is really based on a very healthy performance in the first 6 months, but we know that in the second 6 months there was a bit of a tailing off. So maybe the 9.2 may not be fully realized, but even if it's something like 9 or a little below 9, that's still a reasonable growth. The real problem is it's K-shaped. I mean, some people have done very, very well, and the informal sector and the small and medium, and so they haven't done well. So question is, could we do something for them? And I think for the lower income groups, stronger provision for Magnarega, maybe continuing the Garib Kalyan Yojana, the free food scheme. It could be done for another few months. that's a feasible thing to do, and it's not very expensive.
In fact, even that is something that the finance minister did not commit to, even though she was specifically asked about whether it is going to be extended in any fashion. Pleasure as always to speak to you, Dr. Ahluwalia. Thank you very much for joining us.